que vai nos falar sobre a evolução da individualidade, uma análise histórica, conceitual e experimental. Eu queria agradecer muito a Mark por ter aceitado o convite e ter passado essa semana aqui com a gente. Obrigado.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for sticking around for the last one, and hopefully everyone can stay awake. It's a little cold in here, so maybe that will help. And I want to first say thanks to Charvel and Pedro, the organizers of this project. It's been an incredibly enjoyable week. Really fantastic projects. Get to meet other faculty from other universities to do the evaluation of this project, which I think went very well. And I've learned a lot. I was also just really impressed with the group of students and the research projects that they're working on. So it's great to be able to get an opportunity to speak to them about their projects. And interestingly, sub-project 6, one of the projects in the larger project, is on multi-level selection, which is something that I've worked on for kind of a long time. And so there are students like Livia and Lucia and Andrea and Victor, who are all working on projects with spiders, with leishmaniasis, with other kinds of organisms, thinking about these questions about levels of selection. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is this question of levels, and it's going to be more in an evolutionary context than ecological context. So maybe at the end I'll try to connect the evolutionary and the ecological, but we'll see how that works out. I don't know if you guys saw when the U.S. had, when Obama was first elected, there was like a very famous image of Obama that said hope, and it had this kind of graphic that Shepard Fairey, who's a graffiti artist, had done. And in the same year was the Darwin year, and so this grad student in computer science made these Darwin signs. The one on the end says very gradual change we can believe in, and then you see evolve, change over time, and adapt. I just think it's kind of cool because it makes a connection between science and politics, and also science and art, and so I think this whole idea that you have as part of one of the themes of the project, these applications of science and this sort of interaction of science with the broader society is represented on this title page in that way. So here's what I want to try to do this afternoon. We'll see how successful this is, but the outline is to sort of first provide you a little bit of a historical account of this theory of group selection, which again the people in sub-project 6 are well familiar with. So I'll try not to bore you guys. Bear with me. I hope it's not too redundant for you. And then talk about what I see as a contemporary shift in the way that this debate is taking place, and what's actually finally, I think, maybe moving this debate forward a little bit, at least potentially. And then finally, I'll talk about an experimental experimental investigation of multicellularity that I've been working on for the past couple of years with some colleagues of mine and some students, graduate and undergraduate, at the University of Minnesota. That, again, in the same way that you guys are doing these very synthetic kinds of projects, projects that draw together sort of the applied, the theoretical, epistemological, conceptual, and the social. Let's see. Here's I know you can't read this, it's not necessary for you to read it, but let me just quickly show you the curve. Most of the time when historians do history, they write history, but here, a couple of years ago, some graphic artists made this curve of group selection. So this is history down here. You start in 1859 with Darwin, and you come all the way up to 2000s. And you can see this is sort of the popularity of the idea. So here you have, if this is a theory that you scribble on a napkin, this one you discuss with your colleagues. This one gets its own conference. So as the theory is getting sort of more popular, maybe all the way up to one for the history books, right? So, and this is how group selection does on this metric, not very well. So Darwin starts out a little bit, okay, it goes up into sort of the teens and 20s, and I'll talk a little bit about this. This has to do with Peter Kropotkin and Samuel Morton Wheeler, an entomologist and ant guy. And then in the 1960s, it sort of goes below down here where it's just wrong. So it goes from wrong and up again, sort of looking pretty good, and then drops off in the 70s. This is around the time that Ed Wilson publishes Sociobiology. Oh, sorry. And then, you know, finally, it's sort of climbing back up again. And here you have the publication of David Sloan Wilson and Edward O. Wilson, not related, two biologists talking about rethinking the foundations of sociobiology. So, but now I'm going to actually walk through some of this. And most of the time, when we think about Darwin and we think about evolutionary theory, we think about natural selection, Darwin's mechanism for change, acting on individual organisms or traits. But it's the case actually that Darwin had a slightly more open mind than we tend to give him. And here are just a couple of examples from one from The Origin and one from Descent of Man. So in the first one, he's talking about social insects, and he says, we can perhaps understand how it is that the use of the sting, talking about the honeybee, should so often cause the insect's own death. For if on the whole, the power of stinging be useful to the community, it will fulfill all the requirements of natural selection, though it may cause the death of some few members. So this is sort of the beginning of the discussion about altruism in biology, which becomes a very controversial component of the whole debate over group selection. So here again, in The Descent of Man, let's see, it's 1871, so it's like 12 years later, 12 years after The Origin, he publishes Descent of Man, where he's talking about humans now and human evolution. And he says it must not be forgotten that although as his standard of morality gives but a slight advantage to each individual man and his children over the other men in the same tribe, yet that an advancement in the standard of morality and an increase in the number of well-endowed men will certainly give an immense advantage of one tribe over another. So here you have either cultural group selection or just straight group selection. Now, by the end of the 19th century, so Darwin publishes this in 1871, by the end of the 19th century, a fair amount of sort of consolidation had been happening, and the way that Darwin was being read and understood was not to pay attention to this kind of thinking, or this part of Darwin's thinking, really to pay a lot more attention to competition between individuals as being the driving force in natural selection, except for some folks. So one of those people was the Russian naturalist Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin published a book in 1902 called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. And he essentially argued that most animals are social. And that, in fact, though competition was very much a part of the evolutionary process, so was cooperation. And so in Mutual Aid, he makes this argument using mostly his experience in Siberia. So he had done a number of expeditions in the Siberian sort of ecosystem, a rather harsh ecosystem, where in his experience, unlike Darwin in the tropics, Kropotkin saw animals struggling together against a harsh environment. And his argument was those that were most adept at cooperation were the ones that were most likely to survive. So he says, in this scenario, natural selection ceases to be a selection of haphazard variations, but becomes a physiological selection of those individuals, societies, and groups which are best capable of meeting the new requirements. It operates largely as a selection of groups of individuals, modified all at once, or more or less in a given direction. And again, as is the case with evolution up to the present, Kropotkin is actually more well known in political science departments than he is in biology departments. He's known more in political theory for his anarchist work, and he was in prison twice, once in Russia, once in France, for organizing labor protests, etc. And despite the politics, or well, perhaps because of the politics, we know very little about his career as a professional scientist. He was also very well respected and offered a position at Cambridge University when he was in exile from Russia, which he refused because the condition of taking the professor of geology was that he forego political involvement. So there's Kropotkin talking about mutual aid in the teens and into the 20s. But there was another origin of species, or another origin at least. This was genetics in the origin of species. And this was published by Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Russian immigrant population geneticist in the US in 1937. And this was one of the first sort of founding documents of the modern synthesis. So here again, we go from an allowance for some openness to the ideas of group selection to a more, the beginning of a process of moving to what we now call neo-Darwinism. But in the early versions, in the first version that Dobzhansky published in 1937, he does talk about populations as organisms, or at least populations with sort of constituent components or functions of organisms. So evolutionary plasticity can only be purchased at the ruthlessly dear price of continuously sacrificing individuals to death from unfavorable mutations. He's talking about genetic load. So populations have to carry sort of less fit individuals as their members in order to maintain variability for protection against rapid ecological change. And he also talks about what he calls the physiology of populations. So here again, it sounds like, and going back to these discussions of metaphor and levels that both Gustavo and Donato were talking about, and I think came up in Dan's talks as well, you can see where it sounds again like Dobzhansky is perhaps open to the idea that selection acts at multiple levels. So here he writes, these factors, natural and artificial selection, the manner of breeding characteristic for the particular organism, and its relation to the secular environment and to other organisms existing in the same medium are ultimately physiological, physical, and chemical. And yet, their interactions obey rules sui generis, rules of the physiology of populations, not those of the physiology of individuals. So here you might think about an emergent property, but I'm not sure that Donato would want to go that far. So that's 1937. You get the sort of, the modern synthesis, the neo-Darwinian idea gets established as sort of the standard in evolutionary biology. But group selection, as you saw in the curve, sort of never goes completely away. There are many different folks sort of working on it. In the early 1960s, this guy, V.C. Wynne-Edwards, and actually beginning in the mid-1950s, V.C. Wynne-Edwards starts talking about group selection as a way for populations to maintain themselves at homeostatic levels below the exploitation of resources in the environment. And so there's an interesting parallel with Kropotkin's work in that Wynne-Edwards' experience was also more Arctic than tropical, more temperate and Arctic than tropical. And he spent a lot of time looking at these kinds of birds, and I would draw your attention to this outcropping here. So you have this gannetry in Cape St. Mary. This one is white. This is where the birds are. There's a few birds here. But all of that area, according to Wynne-Edwards, could be colonized, and yet it's not. Why? Thanks. So here, technology. All of that area could be colonized, but it's not. And according to him, it's because of these group selection mechanisms that maintain these populations below the level of exploitation of the environment. As I said, this book that Wynne-Edwards wrote, Animal Dispersion in Relation to Social Behavior, was published in 1962. The modern synthesis was really just beginning to sort of establish itself, and evolutionary biology was sort of coming into its own as a consistent theoretical and empirical mode of explanation in biology, or mode of investigation in biology. When Wynne-Edwards published this paper, it seemed to be invoking these kinds of older arguments about the good of the species that biologists had really tried hard to sort of move beyond. And so the book drew a very critical reaction, especially from some theoretical biologists. Three of the four of these are British guys. There's John Maynard Smith there, David Lack, an ornithologist there, William Donald Hamilton on the bottom, and then the American George C. Williams, who's actually, I need to update that slide. Williams died a couple of years ago. But these guys responded very harshly to the theory of group selection and worked very hard to try to undermine the credibility, the application, any pedagogy associated with it. And it was sort of in the aftermath of the work developed here that group selection, the curve of group selection drops below into wrong. About the mid-1960s was when it was sort of at its worst. And it wasn't the case that this was just an argument against something. It was really the case that Hamilton, the guy with the straw hat, this guy who actually did a lot of his research here in Brazil, had developed the idea of kin selection. And kin selection became the standard explanation for the kind of social behavior, for the kind of altruism that Darwin was interested in, for all kinds of sort of group level phenomena. Another person who was sort of deeply influential here, especially in the 1970s, was Edward O. Wilson. And again, Wilson becomes very interesting later in the story, because initially he's deeply convinced by kin selection explanations of these group level phenomena, and manages to popularize kin selection and inclusive fitness theory in a way that Hamilton was not quite as successful. This work on insect societies, and especially his 1975 book, Sociobiology, had a very huge impact, both in the biological community and in the broader culture. Sociobiology became a very controversial work. The kinds of explanations that Wilson proffered in the last chapter, chapter 26 of the book, the only chapter that dealt with humans, managed to upset any number of feminists, minorities, etc., because of the kinds of biological determinism and biological imperialism that they saw in the sort of sociobiological approach. Nevertheless, this really became the model, and it was that is the sort of the kin selection model, and the increasing focus on natural selection working not only on organisms or traits, but actually on genes or groups of genes. And for group selection, maybe the final nail in the coffin in the mid-1970s was Richard Dawkins' publication of The Selfish Gene. And here we have an explicit kind of statement from Dawkins about what he thinks about how nature works and how natural selection works in nature. So here in The Selfish Gene, Dawkins writes, "Be warned that if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously, you can expect little help from biological nature. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." Now, that's quite a statement, and one that you could clearly argue with, whether it's a sort of empirical biological statement, whether it's a metaphor. This is something that Dawkins often claimed, that he was speaking metaphorically. But around the same time, 1974, Michael Giesland, a philosopher of biology and a working biologist, in his book, The Economy of Nature and the Evolution of Sex, says this about how the process of natural selection works on organisms. When he says, and he writes, "Where it is in his own interest, every organism may reasonably be expected to aid his fellows." So here you have sort of a reciprocal kind of altruism. Where he has no alternative, he submits to the yoke of communal servitude. Yet, given a full chance to act in his own interest, nothing but expediency will restrain him from brutalizing, from maiming, from murdering his brother, his mate, his parent, or his child. How insane is that? Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. So this is a very particular view of nature, one that wasn't shared by everyone, fortunately. So, you know, there were, again, even at the sort of nadir of group selection, there were people like David Sloan Wilson developing mathematical models and arguments to maintain sort of the viability of group selection, and people like Michael J. Wade, who had gotten his PhD at the University of Chicago and worked with flower beetles that were actually part of the group that Donato was talking about, the ecologists at the University of Chicago. Wade had inherited his beetles from Thomas Park. Park was interested in group selection, so there's sort of this genealogy of the idea. And the idea sort of remains open a bit, depends on who you ask. For everything concerning population dynamics, according to Wynne Edwards, group selection is more important than selection at the individual level. For Williams, group level adaptations do not in fact exist. For Richard Dawkins, group selection has soaked up more theoretical ingenuity than its biological interest warrants. And finally, Elliott Silver and David Sloan Wilson on the bottom, group selection is a significant evolutionary force, and its products have been amply documented in nature. So, what's the deal with group selection? Again, depending on who you ask, here's Gould writing in his final book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, with respect to Wynne Edwards and the theory of group selection. Wynne Edwards' claim for group selection may be wrong, but I can cite few other theories presented within evolutionary biology during my career that could be deemed so challenging in implication, so comprehensive in claims, so fascinating in extension, and so thought-provoking. So maybe this provides some kind of an explanation for the persistence of this controversy or the persistence of the interest in this idea. And helps to explain why sub-project 6 is happening, right? But of course, scientists want to know what the right way to approach these phenomena are, whether this kind of theory is actually useful. About 13 years ago, Michael Ruth wrote a book called The Mystery of Mysteries, where he was interviewing different evolutionary biologists to ask them of their points of view on theories. And in the epilogue to the book, talking about these kinds of debates, he says, who is right? They're all right, at least as far as their theories work. And they're all wrong, at least as far as their theories don't work. But there are no absolutes against which we can declare one side right and the other side wrong. Even as we read now, some bright, and note this is 1999, some bright graduate student somewhere is probably about to make his or her name, by resuscitating group selection. So that was 1999. Ed Wilson was not a graduate student in 1999. But in 2007, Ed Wilson resuscitates group selection, which is pretty unusual. Edward O. Wilson, working with David Sloan Wilson, write this paper in the Quarterly Review of Biology called Rethinking the Theoretical Foundations of Sociobiology, where Ed Wilson says, I made a mistake, kin selection isn't really right, group selection is more explanatorily appropriate. And a couple of years later, again, re-invoking some of the ideas that were around in the 1920s, this idea of superorganisms, where you think about, and here again with the metaphor of Gaia or the planet as an organism, thinking about insect colonies as organisms. This is the helpful metaphors, it's an appropriate biological way to understand these entities. For some, in group selection, it is. I think what happens here, and so the title of this slide, Major Transitions, has two meanings. One is for Ed Wilson with respect to the theory of group selection, he makes a major transition. But two is that I think now the controversy over group selection is becoming connected with this question of major transitions in evolution. So what is a major transition? A major transition is from unicellular to multicellular life, from solitary to eusocial, right? These are some of the major transitions that John Maynard Smith and Ernst Zafmari described in their 1995 book, Major Transitions in Evolution. And it's the kind of argument that I developed in my book, Evolutionary Restraints, and from 2010, and Samir Okasha, a philosopher of biology at Bristol in the UK, developed in his book, Evolution and the Levels of Selection. So that's the history. So that's part one. I'll try to speed up. Part 2 is the experimental evolution question. So 2 years ago, David Queller, a philosopher of biology, came to the University of Minnesota, gave us a talk on organismality. What is an individual? What is an organism in biology? If evolutionary biologists and ecologists, when I think Dan was talking about populations, and you need to count, and you need to be able to predict how many of this are there, how many of that are there. If we don't have enough of this, how do we get more if we need that? If we have too much of that, how do we get rid of those kind of invasive or proliferating species? This photo appeared under my door. Someone slid it under my door and had a question on it. It was written, which of these are the individuals? And so I took and drew hats on them, and I said, the ones wearing the hats. Those were the biggest ones and sort of the most defined ones, but I wasn't sure.
Did you tape up your window after that?
But yeah. but the interesting bit is that if you go back, and then I also wrote on the bottom, where after I wrote the ones wearing the hats, I wrote this passage from Darwin. So this is from The Voyage of the Beagle, where Darwin writes, of these polypi, so he's talking about coral polyps, in a large specimen there must be many thousands, yet we see they act by one movement. They have also one central axis connected with a system of obscure circulation. And the ova are produced in an organ distinct from the separate individuals. Well, may one be allowed to ask, what is an individual? And so that's something that now sort of, when these guys had this question, they had this question because they had started working with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which I'll talk about in a second. But now I'm starting to think, okay, so historically, how do we identify individuals? Sometimes it's straightforward, sometimes it's not so much. And this was a question that persisted for biologists, for theoretical biologists. In 1912, Julian Huxley, grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, writes The Individual in the Animal Kingdom. In 1915, Charles Manning Child, a developmental biologist, writes a book about individuality in organisms. And again, for some of us, for some kinds of organisms, characteristic megafauna, it's quite clear. I can recognize all the individuals in this room, it's easy. But when you have sort of colonial organisms or these kinds of things, it's maybe not so clear. You have symbiotic mutualisms. Is this getting too bad?
Yeah. Awesome.
So if life starts like this, unicellular, how do we go from that to that? For a long time, we thought that this would take hundreds of millions, maybe billions of years, but maybe not. Maybe it can go fast, and let's try. The idea was for us to try to figure out how this could go. So my colleagues and I took. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. You could go this way. You could take a small cell and just get bigger. And then you could start to get invagination, and you could get developments that way. Or you could sort of stick together, right? Maybe you could just not divide completely, or you could aggregate and make a multicellular organism that way. So these were the two possible adaptive solutions. We took Saccharomyces cerevisiae, a single-celled eukaryote, and decided to put it under strong selection and see if we could select for bigger yeast and see how they would get bigger. So you take the yeast and you put them in liquid medium, and then you leave them go for 24 hours, shaking in incubation. And then you centrifuge 100 grams for 10 seconds. And then you throw away the top 93%. And so what you have in that bottom 3% are the fat yeast, the big ones. And then you take that 3 out, you put it in the next test tube, and you do it again. And this is experimental evolution. You can use microbes and you can vary ecological conditions, and you can see what happens, right? And so that's what we did in 10 replicate populations, and in all 10 replicate populations, we put this stress on them, and over 60 transfers, and usually by about 14 transfers, you can see that they're developing this pellet. That's the yeast at the bottom. Those are the big fat yeast that are collecting at the bottom after you spin them down. So by the 14th transfer, you have that, and by 60 transfers, you're getting this really kind of fat pellet. And we got both phenotypes. We got some kind of big ones, the large cell genotype there. That's the normal size cell on the top. But we also got these. And I don't know, can you see those? So they look a little bit like snowflakes. That's what we call them. This is population 1, population 2, 3, 4, 5. All of them develop this morphology.